You're listening to Art Affairs, episode number 5. Today I'll be talking to Alex Kuno. So my name's Michael Faith, and this is Art Affairs. If this is your first time listening, thanks a ton for tuning in. Art Affairs is meant to give you a look at and into the new contemporary art community, featuring conversations with artists, gallerists, curators, printmakers, shining a spotlight on the human side of the wonderful work they do. You can dig through previous episodes, complete with show notes, at artaffairs.podcast.com. And you can check out new episodes on all your favorite podcast platforms. Of course, if you like what I'm doing here, be sure to subscribe. And you can always connect with the show on Instagram and Facebook at Art Affairs Podcast. All right, so today's guest is St. Paul-based artist Alex Kuno. Alex is somebody that I'd never actually met before doing the interview. I'd followed his work on Instagram for a while, but never really had the opportunity to meet him before. So because of that, I had a ton of questions for him. So I'm really grateful he was able to come on the show. We talk about some of the challenges that he experienced growing up in a small town north of Minneapolis, how he got started with his art career, how it sort of didn't quite work out at first, but then he ultimately kind of found his way and his voice, and then ultimately how his work has transitioned in the last few years quite a bit. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Alex Kuno. Alex, thanks a ton for coming on the show, man. It's really great to have you on.
Oh, thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. So you're actually the first person that I've interviewed that I've never met in person before.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And so there's a ton that I'm curious about. And so I guess let's start with like your background. From what I've read, you grew up not far from like where you live now in a suburb north of the Twin Cities. So what was your childhood like? Was it sort of that typical suburban experience?
It kind of was. I kind of see the town that I grew up in. It was like a kind of a small suburb, a mix between a small town, small suburb. It was sort of like the town in Blue Velvet. That's kind of how I see it. You know, like the picket fences and really nice, but there was a really seedy kind of underbelly to it. But as far as like just a blissful childhood experience. You know, we lived kind of close to a river. There were a lot of parks and stuff like that. So it was kind of bucolic in a lot of ways. But as I grew up, I started to see a lot of the really deep-seated, you know, racism and kind of like the old sort of secrets. I started to like kind of pick up on that. And so it has a really kind of dark undertone for me when I think back on it.
What was that something that you felt at the time you were growing up, or is it just something you look back on and noticed?
It actually really got, it was nationally notorious. As a matter of fact, when I was in high school, there were, you know, Klans members like handing out recruitment pamphlets to other students and stuff like that. I remember I was walking past one of the social studies classes, and they had a project where you would make a poster of your favorite amendment. And one of the amendments was the First Amendment. And then on that poster was a Klansman with like flaming eyes.
Holy cow.
And it said like, it's our right. But of course they spelled our wrong. So it's A-R-E, right? But they had, what do you call them? They had, assemblies where there were, pickup trucks with Confederate flags in them, like driving around in the stadium and stuff like that. It was, it was pretty grim there. I think it like actually made national news.
Jeez.
So yeah. So it really did kind of like shape a lot of, kind of how I just saw my own people and where I came from. And I think I still think about that time and, growing up there. I kind of inject some of that in my work too.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can imagine. What sort of work did like your parents do?
They were both teachers. My mom was a substitute elementary school teacher, and my dad taught English music. Or English music, just high school music.
Okay. From what I've read, I think it was an interview you gave last year. You had said that your parents had a quote unquote turbulent marriage. If you feel comfortable talking about that, is that something that impacted you a lot? Like, was that especially difficult for you to deal with that you were exposed to?
I would say so. I think that was also a big reason why I'm an artist too. I think like when just kind of a way to escape that home life, I would really just kind of disappear into my room, and then I would just draw science fiction, horror drawings, just things to kind of create my own little world in my room as just a way to kind of get away from that, and or just process what was happening in the house through drawing and sketching. And so I remember as I got older, I would think about, now, what do I want to be when I actually go out into the world? Like, what do I want as a profession? And I always kind of thought, well, I always wanted to recreate that feeling of being able to process the world on my own terms and in my own way. And so that's kind of how I just developed my own, the kind of the therapeutic use for artwork.
Yeah. Do you feel like it was also just a matter of like, that's something that you had uniquely had complete control over, whereas the things around you really didn't, that sort of thing?
It was kind of like that. It was like making a world that you could control. Yeah. And so a lot of that's been infused into my work over the years, definitely.
Interesting. What were like your biggest artistic influences or inspirations back then?
Back then, I was a sci-fi nerd. I was an introverted little kid. So I think like 80s anime, Star Wars, Terry Gilliam movies, Monty Python was a huge one. Kids in the Hall.
Oh, I love them.
Yeah. So like acerbic kind of avant-garde comedy, and horror. Yeah. Stephen King, science fiction, things like that.
Okay. Very cool. And then so you ultimately went to school at the University of Minnesota. Do they have a pretty big, like, healthy arts program there?
When I went, they absolutely didn't. It was I went there right before they had built like a brand new art facility. So it was like back in the 90s, and so we were taking art classes in almost like a condemned warehouse. And it would rain. We would go outside to smoke or something like that. And there'd be just a big barrel with like dead rats in it. It was just like kind of sinking into the river as it was just a completely forgotten about derelict area of the university. And the university is this sprawling giant campus, but like all the art kids were kind of like shuffled off into this kind of gross, grim area.
Has that sort of like changed a lot since you went there?
As soon as I graduated, they had built a brand new facility, so it was like, sparkling. But then when I moved to, or when I graduated, I moved to New York City after that, and I kind of felt like that's where I learned about the personalities of the art world and how that worked a little bit better.
What prompted your move to New York?
I think it was maybe a year or two after I graduated. My dad had just died. I was working as like a living skills instructor, like teaching art classes to developmentally disabled adults. I really needed a change. I wasn't like focusing on what I wanted to, and I just needed the experience of moving to. I just needed the experience of New York. I just needed to kind of have that cliched artist experience, and I totally did. So I moved there 10 days before September 11th.
Oh wow!
And so so my time there was pretty much framed by that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what sort of work did you do while you were there?
I worked. I worked as an art handler, and an art installer for the Pat Hearn Gallery and American Fine Arts Gallery. So I had a lot of experience, like kind of talking to the artists who came through and driving around the streets, kind of picking up art from other artists and installing shows, and worked at the Armory show one year. And yeah, that was a pretty crazy time.
You probably had exposure to quite a lot of different styles of art. Had you like sort of found your own artistic voice at that point, or were you still exploring like different styles, techniques?
Yeah, I was totally in exploration mode. I had no idea what my style was or what I was doing. I was like pretty much overwhelmed by all those other artists that came through. And I went there not to have like shows or even necessarily make money in art or anything like that. I just wanted to experience what it was, what you're supposed to be like as an artist. I wanted to have, I wanted to kind of meet kind of the worst case scenario of the artist's personality. So I knew like just who they were. And I so got that. And I also got to see a lot of how the business worked. There was one show that I had, or that I was working at, and there was one of the artists that I was walking by the night of the opening. He had like an 8-foot, or it was maybe like a 6-foot tall canvas, and it was just like paint kind of smeared on it, and then a Polaroid of somebody urinating. And then he was like kind of scribbling paint on it, and then he like looked back over at me and he kind of gave me this kind of snarky look, and he went, "Hey man, I'm not even done with this yet." And then he like went back to keep painting it, and it sold for $60,000.
Oh wow!
And so I'll always remember that as being like, yeah, those cliches, those stereotypes are totally true. Like that was like something out of a sitcom. That it was like, hey man, I don't even care that I'm here.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm sure that sort of gave you a different perspective on just the artist's life. Were you showing your work in galleries yet at that point?
I at like pretty much coffee shops. I did have a really interesting show in in North Carolina, of all places. I think like I got a bunch of opportunities because just of my location as being an artist in New York. And so just randomly I was just asked to participate in this figurative art show in this museum in Appalachian State University. And so that was actually a good experience. But otherwise, a lot of my shows were, in coffee shops or really small galleries in and around the city. And back then, if I had a style, I guess it was, I really took my work really seriously. I had to do big, grim looking charcoal drawings that were kind of like more inspired by, I thought I was like being inspired by Rembrandt or something like that. I thought I had to make something really serious and dark and grim looking. And then that totally flipped and changed when I moved back from New York.
Yeah, so you ultimately moved back to Minnesota where you live now. What led to that? Did you just not like the New York sort of experience that you'd seen, or was it more of an attempt to go back to your roots?
Well, I'd gotten married at that time, and so to kind of be a good husband and kind of live a normal life, I think is more of what she wanted for us. And so I thought like maybe the more responsible thing to do would be to move back with her. Yeah. And so we had gotten a house back in Minneapolis. And so we were going to live like a regular 9-to-5 lifestyle back home. That was kind of the assumption.
Okay. And from what I've read, you started like working at office jobs and more like, I think, tech support, stuff like that. I mean, it almost felt like, and maybe this was just my read of that article, was that you were sort of just giving up that art experience. It's almost like, hey, I did that. I didn't really like it. I'm done with it. Now I'm doing this other thing. Was that really what you were feeling at the time?
I was kind of getting pressure from my in-laws and from my wife to like go, okay, well, now we have a home, now we have a house, now we kind of live this life now. And so I did feel that pressure to do that. And I had thought that I had talked myself out of it. I thought like, okay, well, I had my artist experience and now I'm going to go work in an office now. And then maybe I'll pick up the art stuff later. And that wound up just being torture. It was like a really, really dark time. And it was a dark transition coming back from New York to Minneapolis. And, it was after 9/11 too. And so my hometown, Minneapolis, had changed a lot, like maybe even more than New York had. That was a really huge shift of, suddenly, walking to a library or a store and seeing guns are banned in these premises. It just felt like a different place. And so it was a really dislocating alien feeling coming back, especially, and then kind of like injecting myself into a life that just felt so wrong and off. It was kind of like being sent back into a weird kind of dimension that I was unhappy in. And so then we got divorced soon after. And then I kept at the office jobs for a little while longer. And then eventually I started pursuing the art again. And I really switched my style around and started over from scratch. And then almost immediately within that year, I was doing art full time. So
yeah, that's interesting. So, that seems like a watershed moment almost for you, where you sort of reintroduced yourself to art, kind of solidified your style a bit. What allowed you, or I guess what gave you the comfort to give up your full-time job, your day job, in order to become a full-time artist?
Yeah, I think it was. It was mostly, I think it came from just the psychological necessity first. I had, like I said, within that first year, I was approached by a lot of local galleries, and I started selling this new body of work like just immediately. And I was like, hey man, I just made like $2,000. I'm out of here. And so I quit my job, and then I didn't sell anything again for like another year. After that, I was like, hey man, this is it. I'm out. See ya. And then I just jumped out of there, and then immediately learned like, oh, now I have to start over again. So that was another learning experience too.
That's interesting. So, the work that you've done throughout your career seems to participate in several series that span multiple years, sort of each. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those. The first of them that I'm really aware of is, and I think your longest running one, is the Miscreants of Tiny Town, right? That was back in, I think, 2007 when you started that.
Yeah.
And you sort of described that, like in your own words, as putting a playful, childlike face on the formless anxieties that keep stressed out grown-ups awake at night, which I absolutely love. But sort of to still sort of simplify that, it's got a very Lord of the Flies vibe, almost like children thrown into real world that they now have to deal with, and adult situations that they have to make sense of. Is that sort of what you were going for?
Yeah, very much so. I think it was a reflection of well, I think that a lot of that kind of fairy tale work was almost a caricature of just my own anxieties, and kind of a hyperbolic expression of just how I felt about the world. I mean, it was about the marriage. It was like also kind of self-deprecating about, why do I have this need to pursue this childlike activity of drawing and painting when, it was during the Iraq War, it was during the insurgency, it was like all these things kind of falling apart. And I was like, here I am, like I can't function without drawing and making a go of this. And it's such like a selfish, childlike pursuit. Also around that time, I was doing the day job thing. and the office work. And so I think how it started was back in 2005, or how those ideas started to come together was that I was doing this tech support work. I was like helping people with their Norton antiviruses. And so I was like listening to these old people like crying on the phone because they keep seeing blinking signs about the antivirus like on their laptops, and they didn't know what their desktop was. And so I was sitting on there with a headset, and then I would just be kind of doodling these circles on some notepads. And then those circles turned into faces, and then those faces like were kind of how I imagined those people looked, or how they felt, I guess. And so then I kind of, and they all kind of looked like these sort of deformed children doodles. And so those deformed doodles kind of became this fantasy world that I had created. And yeah, I think it was about, since the story of that Miscreants of Tiny Town thing was about these, it was about the souls of these children who were kind of deposited into like a purgatorial landscape, and they all had to create their own personalities and their own societies, and they had to deal with the elements and stuff like that. And so there'd be like these characters like different cults or different mixed creatures, and they would kind of evolve the longer that they're there. And so it was a place where I could just kind of put my perspectives on what was happening in the world, or what was happening to myself. There was a time, like I think around 2012, I was having a solo show every month almost.
Oh, wow.
And so the work just kind of like some of the shows, the theme of the show would be about my anxiety about getting to make the deadline of that show. So it was like, they were almost cartoons in a lot of ways, or like quickly done improvisational pieces.
Yeah. So how long did that series ultimately run? Is that still something that you like to create work for now, or have you pretty much set that aside, said it's done?
I think right now things are just so up in the air. They kind of exploded. I think like maybe 2015, that's when there was a really huge shift in my work a lot. When I was maybe in New York, or maybe moving back from New York, I was married in a life that I didn't necessarily want. And there was kind of that fairy tale idea about being married and having the 9-to-5 job, living in a suburban area of Minneapolis. This idea of like, that's what an ideal is supposed to be. And around that time was when George Bush, about the war on terror and the Taliban and stuff like that, he had said that the Taliban, they're at war with us because they hate us for our freedoms. And there was something so simplified and cheap and childish about that, where it didn't fit the situation at all. And so I kind of made a connection to that with being married in that situation of like, there's a grid and a world that we're kind of funneled into, and these myths that we're taught about what we're to believe, the idea of like the Taliban hates us for our freedoms, that is such a way to trigger like these kind of nationalist images in our mind. And so I somehow was able to conflate those two ideas and inject that into this fairy tale land that I was building.
Interesting.
And so I think, there was a group of characters in the Miscreants of Tiny Town that I called the mongrels. They were like these wolf characters that had, like, the longer these kids spend in this land, they kind of mutate and sort of become the personalities that they were injected with. And so some had mutated into these wolf characters who would, they kind of existed mostly out of the bounds of the paintings that I was working in. And so these kids, they would have narratives that would be shaped by the events of this secret cult of wolf people that sort of lived beyond where they could see, and they would sort of shape their stories and shape these kids' paths and narratives, and then lead them to a place where they would eventually like kind of herd these kids. They were kind of like guiding their stories, and treating the children as like livestock. So at a certain season, the time they would like kind of descend and then hunt them down. And then there were other kids who were associated with the mongrels who would like kind of pick out which of the kids were the sickest or which were the ones who might fight back and stuff like that. And so it was sort of about these secret undercurrents in society, that were happening. But then in 2015, there was like a spate of really brutal police shootings that happened, especially here locally. Philando Castile and Trayvon Martin, and so there were a lot of those things, and it was just hitting me so hard. Seeing like this just gruesome violence on Twitter and Facebook, like just kind of scrolling through, and in between puppy videos and commercials, there would be really terrible violence. And I think like around a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening, it just almost seemed like this sort of secret strain of authoritarianism was really out in public. And then the election happened, and it just sort of felt like all of those secret threads that were kind of, of the misogyny or racism and authoritarianism that has kind of built the country, that was just out in public now. It was just on the news. It's just people openly declaring it, like, this is not the country you thought it was, or that you were led to believe. And so I think like those kids in my Miscreants of Tiny Town series, I think they kind of exploded. And so it was like just the emotion, like you can't, like, how am I supposed to put this kind of grief into something that might be interesting or pleasing to look at? And so I just like had this feeling of like these kids just blowing up. And so that's sort of when the series ended, I think. It was like the children, or these figures that I was working in for years, just spontaneously started mutating. And so even though they're exploding, there are guts, but there are also aquatic forms or flowers or kind of alien shapes. And I sort of see those exploding figures as they're in the process of transformation, and you don't know what the end result is going to be or what they're transforming into. So you're just kind of left as a still image to like look at the middle of a transformational process.
Yeah, and so that's the Awful series, right? What you're describing, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you had at some point called it just a pile of guts.
Yeah.
That was your brief description of that.
I tend to, I tend to describe my stuff in frustrated terms.
The some of those like later series that you've sort of transitioned into have become a bit more explicit, but they still have that sort of storybook quality and aesthetic to them that makes them more approachable. Is that sort of the intent, or is that just sort of how your style naturally marries with the themes you want to express?
Well, I'm glad you kind of see the fairy tale aspect of it, because this new stuff is pretty gnarly. I do have to like say that, but I do like the innocent kind of joyful quality of it. I think, like I said from the beginning, all my work is kind of about, it's trying to keep that feeling of childhood, or that innocence of childhood, of just playful exploration, letting your mind wander and things like that. So I think all my stuff always comes from an innocent place. And, and so, with this, erotic, or some call it pornographic work that I've been doing, I think it just came from a time, or it came from this impulse of like, I just need to do something that's fun, and like, just like make something that's just for me, and something utopian, too. I think, with climate change and again, the whole global authoritarianism thing, that, uh, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around and be emotionally productive about. So I think instead of just going too far down into like these apocalyptic holes, like I had to think of a way to carry that idea of mutation and evolution or spontaneous evolution in a utopian way. And I think I think like over time, I think that's where I want to focus my work. I want to focus my work in a utopian, hopeful way. Because I think the apocalyptic stuff just, I don't think that's very sustainable, especially like in the next few years. Who knows? It will just be current news. So,
right. Yeah. Yeah. I was sort of surprised reading, some of the articles that I read that your work was so much influenced by the politics, and sort of your change in themes tend to correspond with changes in political regimes and, the overwhelming culture across the country. I never really sort of expected that to have as much effect on your work as it has. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. A lot of people are surprised by that. I think I do see these as kind of almost being like political cartoons in a way. Or one of my favorite kinds of artwork is the new objectivity movement from Germany and Austria and Poland and stuff like that before World War II, or after World War I, I guess, where there were just these really grim, surreal political cartoons in a lot of ways, or just like kind of current events, sort of like during the Depression, there would be the musicians going around the country in the United States where they're just like singing news reports, like, and they shot him dead and then his family died and then and so I kind of see my work in that vein, I guess. That's kind of how I see it. But, well, no, I don't know. I don't even know if that's true. I think because I try to be so improvisational, I don't look at my work as being, I'm going to be making a painting about this specific political issue. I don't do that at all. I think I just try to access my feelings and my thoughts at a current moment. And then, I read the news a lot, and I think that it comes out that way. And it's a way for me to process the world in the way that, I tried to process the world as a little kid. I think that's the connection.
That's interesting. And obviously, a lot of your work tends to involve telling a story. You seem to have a very clear kind of overarching narrative. Is that something intentional? Is that something you think about a lot? It sounds like you do. But is that something you kind of go in with?
Yeah, I do. I try to. Both my parents were atheists. And I was always really interested in religious artwork since I was a toddler, or as long as I can remember, at least. There was always something so fascinating about it. But I never got the underlying story behind any of these things. My mom was trying to be really encouraging by showing me art and taking me to museums and trying to get me invested in that. But she had no idea what I was looking at or why I was looking at those things. So I would ask her, what is this figure doing? What is that figure? And then she'd just be like, I don't know. I think that's supposed to be Jesus. I think the thing that's being wounded there, I think that's Jesus. So I loved the idea of creation myth and stories. And so Northern Renaissance art made a huge impact on me because it looked so realistic and so lifelike, but also totally off and totally wrong at the same time. But I got this feeling of like, there was this group of people somewhere at some point trying to tell me something Like they're trying to communicate something to me and I can't understand the language. And there was that disconnect that was just so appealing. It was kind of like, looking at a G.I. Joe fort when I was a kid, like, oh, I want to shrink down and live inside that G.I. Joe fort. I want to fight Cobra, but I can't because he's too small. Or I just want to exist in these fantasy worlds. Or, growing up on Star Wars and seeing that there was this world that exists that I can't participate in. I can only witness. And so there was a lot of that in the start of that Miscreants of Tiny Town series, where it was like during the Iraq War and the whole they hate us for our freedoms stuff. I I tried to read Lord of the Rings, and I remember reading the prologue where they were talking about the different species of hobbits and the evolution of the hobbits. And I had this self-deprecating feeling. Or no, this was before I started that Miscreants of Tiny Town series, and I was feeling really lost and kind of really dark about the world and what I expected out of my own self and own artwork. And so I was reading this really, really deeply detailed world that was being built, this fantasy world. And I had to sit and read about the evolution of the hobbits and the different species of hobbits and going, wait a minute, this is all bullshit. This is all fake. Why am I sitting here reading this fake book with these fake figures? And then I thought, just how, it just made me really step back and take a more critical look about these pop culture world building sort of exercises and what are they for? What are they trying to teach us? Like Star Wars, like how I knew more about the bounty hunters in Empire Strikes Back than I knew about members of my own family. I knew about their backstories. And so I took that world building so for granted. But then at some certain point when the world just got really real, it just, I wanted to turn that on its head. And so I made that Miscreants of Tiny Town series as sort of sarcastically, almost, and also self-deprecatively. I don't know if that's a word, but or self-mockingly about storytelling and why we need the stories and why we need these detailed myths. And so I looked at that Miscreants of Tiny Town series. I wanted that floral kind of purple sort of sounding name. The Miscreants of Tiny Town, oh, hey, I can do this too. Isn't this silly? Isn't this stupid? But then the more that I got into it, the more obsessed I got with it, and then felt I couldn't leave it. I was building these characters and these recurring themes, and I made maps and stuff like that. So over time, I totally fell into that trap. I totally got it.
For sure. How real are the characters to you? I mean, do they come back in a recurring form?
They did for a long. They did for a while, or at least since I saw them as, like I said, the souls of these lost children. I sort of infused the energies of certain characters into it, or I would repeat their uniforms or their costumes. In certain ways, I always saw these kids as being dolls in a way. There was even a time when I made 3D figures of of those kids and had them step out of the paintings and into a model train or model railroad landscapes and things like that. But as far as how real they are to me, I think that the emotions that they had, or the look in their eyes or their facial expressions, those were things that I really paid attention to. I think that that was the focus and the meaning of what I was kind of going for, the sort of hyperbolic facial expressions. But also I saw them as being as dolls, and that's carried into my current work too. That idea of keeping the characters and the figure's consistent in my work, even though I'm having aliens having sex now or interdimensional creatures fornicating. But they're still they still have certain poses. They're still like kind of these angular sort of classic poses that I've taken from Northern Renaissance art, like the Byzantine or Russian Orthodox head tilt and the Northern Renaissance kind of body poses, those like really artificial looking angular poses. That's kind of what is a through line for me, I think.
Yeah. And so as your work has started to shift into like you said, more explicit themes, there can be a divide, for some artists between commercial viability versus like artistic truth and authenticity. How important do you think it is for artists to consider that? Does that just get in the way, or is it something people should really think about when they go into it?
Yeah, I think I see the purchase of art, or how I want it to be, how I like to imagine it, is that I see that connection between the artist and the viewer. It's like a weird conversation. Like when you make art, you're making up your own language. This is going to seem really like a really kind of hippie sort of response to your question. But I think like when artists make work, they're creating their own visual language. They're kind of going out into the world and going blah, 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 blah. And then and you keep saying it, and then you keep saying it, and you go blah, 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 and then you go out in public and you say this nonsense language, but then somebody hears you and they go, I understand what you're saying. And then they go blah, 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 and then you have this conversation, and then when they understand what you're saying, they give you money, and then they keep that thing that you just said. That's really kind of how I see it. And that's how I want it to be. And I've had a lot of those experiences where it's really invigorating. It's not about the money. It's about you're connecting with other people and you're saying something that somebody wants to keep and then use as an investment somewhere down the line, or hand off to their kids, or they see something that strikes them at the moment of their lives that they see it. And that's at least how I see the value of money in my art, I guess. But so that said, like, I think it's always been so much more rewarding for me to sell work to like nurses or bank tellers, or like postal workers, people who like come to like art crawls or art shows and stuff, and they see something personally that they like. It just feels really sad and kind of dystopian, this idea of like the high-end art world and being with the gatekeepers and stuff like that, when your work just kind of gets sent away to some vault somewhere and is just used as a tax dodge, or some money laundering scheme. That's really how I see like the high-end art world. And that just kind of makes the profession just really draining and not interesting at all to me.
Has social media helped you connect with people more individually, or is it?
Absolutely it has. But to get to the idea about moving into like explicit work, that was a huge change. I did like kind of take a deep breath before I started posting that, because it was like maybe almost 10 years I'd been doing that Miscreants of Tiny Town thing, and I had developed an international clientele of like people who wanted to see me make paintings about children being in pain or like running away from things. And so I thought, well, what would happen if I showed two monsters having sex? What if I did that? And not just that, but in like really graphic, like medical detail. And I just kind of like hope that maybe I'll just put it out there and see what happens. And then it wound up that a lot of people preferred that to this kid thing. And so I think I don't know what any of that means in the grand scheme of things. And social media helps so much because you do have like this immediate reaction from people around the world. And so I feel like maybe I'm participating in a bigger conversation, or that I'm communicating something that relates. I don't know. Anyway, I'm really grateful that the work has got me attention that it has been lately. So I don't know. I lucked out. I think with Instagram and social media and stuff, it is such a great. It's almost like a sketchbook. Like if I'll just toss out an idea and just go, here's a thing that I doodled. Here's a thing that I don't know if I feel like finishing, or here's something that didn't pan out. It was like it just throwing it out into the ether. Because it's almost like you have an art show that's constantly there 24 hours a day. You're in like your work is just constantly out, and you can just post it whenever. And I can look at it and go, okay, well, it's clear this isn't really working for people, or oh my God, this thing I didn't think was anything just kind of exploded. But then at the same time, you have to know that Instagram and social media, there are all these fake algorithms. And so it's not a real connection with real people, but it's a virtual connection with virtual people almost, or it's another, just kind of surreal kind of snapshot of how people work and how people use technology and how people look at your work.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, but I mean, still it's valuable in a way.
Yeah. Do you have any like advice that you'd give to young artists who are starting out that might be struggling with this sort of thing?
With social media, or how to handle it, or
well, like how to stay true to their artistic vision. I guess the original like part of that question, right? If they're wanting to go into something with more adult themes, but are afraid of the algorithms and afraid of it being acceptable, how do you recommend that they stay the path?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it is such a strange brain mutating kind of thing. And I think, like, I would say young people have a completely different relationship than I do to social media and how that works. Like, I grew up, or, I started my art career sending out slides, to galleries, or mailing applications out. And so now that it's exploded, you can get as much attention as you want to, now. And so I think personally what helps for me is that I use Instagram as just like, I think, like I said, as like a sketchbook or a diary, a journal. I use it just for myself. It's not, I don't go into it, or maybe I started it that way. Now I kind of go in knowing that I have an audience and a following.
Do you think that changes the way that you use it?
Knowing that I have a following?
Yeah. Knowing that there's like people on the other side now.
Yeah. I think maybe it does. Yeah, of course. I'm sure it does. And I'm sure it's affecting my work in ways I have no idea to, because this stuff, it's designed to get into your brain. I think maybe, if you, man, it's a scary time. Like we are like our brains are being mutated by this stuff. And so, like, to give like advice to a child, like, they are a different species from me as a 44-year-old and how they interact with technology. So and to like tell a kid, like, just stay true to yourself. But if how they view themselves as being true to themselves is how they're being responded to by a corporate algorithm like Instagram, like, we're all going crazy. So I think I would just say, hey, make work that you like, I think, and struggle and fight and be your toughest critic. And that anybody who says anything online to you, for some reason, I've dodged bullets online. I'm really shocked that I haven't gotten much harsher criticism. I don't know why I haven't. But, people can say terrible things to other people online. I think you should be your harshest critic, and all of that other stuff is noise. You should be especially critical, and you should look at your own work through your own eyes as much as possible, and look at it and go, if I saw this work on Instagram, if I, was flipping through and saw it, would I like it? And what would I do to change it if I didn't? And if I see artwork online or on Instagram from somebody else and I like it, I have to think about why I like it and think really seriously about it. And if you see something that on Instagram that you don't like, or in a museum, God forbid you go outside. But if you go to a museum and you see a piece of art that you don't like, you have to think consciously and deliberately why you don't like it. And think about what it is about your own brain or makeup or life experience that makes you not like things, or what is about your own experience that makes you not like your own work, and what you want to do to change it. I think maybe that's what it is. If art is really about making a world that you control, you don't really need these other people or these other like little bits and bops in the algorithm to tell you what to make. And that's so easier said than done, I think, because, again, our brains are literally being changed by these, so, just to tell a 14-year-old, like how to.
It's a difficult proposition.
Yeah. Oh God. They have a fundamentally different brain than we have now, I think.
Yeah. So, like, shifting gears a little bit to talk about your process and your studio practice. For a long time, you worked out of a home studio. Is that still the case? Do you still work out of your home?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always done that. I don't know if I'd ever want to go to a studio away from where I live.
What's your typical studio practice now? Do you just sort of like plot out your schedule throughout the week, or do you just wake up and just start working?
Well, yeah, it kind of depends, I think. When I have deadlines, I tend to work at 11:30 at night. That's usually when I start working, and then I'll go through the night. And then I'll do like business emails during the day and kind of take little cat naps and stuff like that throughout the day, and then get back to work at 11:30 at night. So yeah, I'm totally nocturnal, I think.
I don't think that's very unusual for artists. I know a lot of artists that just tend to work throughout the night, which is always, I'm completely opposite, right? I tend to be more of a morning and work during the day, but I've also always worked in offices. So like that's just my experience. But there's a lot of artists that seem to just work overnight, and I've always found that fascinating.
Well, that's cool. I've the musician Nick Cave, years ago, he used to talk about when he would be recording, he would wake up in the morning and wear a suit, and then he'd make the band members wear suits, and that's pretentious. But at the same time, it's like, I like the idea of like, you sit down and you work during the day, and then when you're done, you go home, and then you spend the rest of your night. And I've always like admired that, like what you were talking about, what you do, that, I would like to be able to do that, but I'm just way more comfortable working at night. And, I work in a building full of other artists, and, the building on the ground floor is open to the public. And so it's like really active and noisy, and a lot of neighbors coming in and out. It's just really easy to be interrupted during the day. But at night, it's like there's still like this other hum of life going on of other artists who are, working and stuff like that. But they're all kind of tucked away in their own little spaces. And so there's something, really comforting about it.
Do you find that having so many artists around you in that sort of rich artist environment, do you find that that's helped you in some way as far as like, being, I guess, inspired by other artists and having just that culture around you all the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think mostly, how like when you talk to an artist, they normally, at least maybe it's just a regional thing, but for me, it's like the other artists, we only talk about supplies and tools and the building of what we're doing or the techniques that we use, not really about the subject matter at all. And so I think being surrounded by other artists, it's useful mostly because we can walk past each other and go, ugh, right? It sucks. We can commiserate with each other. I've been living off of like these local art crawls for the past 10 years. And so we have like open studio tours twice a year. And so I can, I've been able to survive pretty well off of those. But this past fall one was brutal. It was like, nobody made any money. Nobody came through. It was sudden too. It was like, it wasn't like a gradual drop off. It was like nobody was around. I think it might have just been like a cold snap or something, caught people off guard. But it took like a whole month to sort of recoup that. And everybody felt it at the same time. And there was something really comforting about like everybody going, this sucks. This is really hard. Oh, that was painful. And like even just the other day, I was talking to some friends and going, God, that sucked. And that we all were like, we're all in this together and it all sucks. So that's kind of a dour way of looking at it, but it's still really helpful. It's just good to know that, doing the art thing, it really does go against what we're taught we're supposed to want in a lifestyle, I guess, when you are kind of taught in the culture that you're supposed to want like the office jobs and the good office and the structure and things like that. When you don't have the structure or institutions that you're with, when you are just kind of flying by the seat of your pants, you are kind of looked at as lazy or insane or something like that. Even though you're working maybe twice or three times harder than most people who aren't in the field. So to be surrounded by a community like that, even though we're all doing different things and living different lives, there's still it's really important.
Do those art crawls, you mentioned the art crawls, and I know that's something that you've been involved with for a while. Do you feel that goes back to your desire to connect with people because you're actually face to face with them? They're coming in your studio, you're talking to them. Yeah,
that's been a really huge thing. It's taught me how to sell work, and it's taught me how to take pride in what I do on a different level. And it's also been great because like a huge variety of people come through, like people who aren't like the artsy gatekeeper types, like just regular guys who, families and stuff who are just out. I live next to a baseball stadium, like right next door to a minor league baseball stadium in the neighborhood. And so it'd be like baseball fans coming through, with their red single cups and stuff like that. And so you get to like meet like all different types of people and then try to like kind of appeal, or kind of like show, hey, I'm just a normal guy. I just happen to make interdimensional pornography. So, but it's helped me to like, get up and approach people and shake people's hand and stuff like that. And introduce myself and talk about my work. I know, like, during this podcast, I've been stammering and stuttering and stuff like that.
No. I think it's good. As far as, like, the mediums that you work in, I see you work in a lot of different mediums, from oils to acrylics to watercolors, chalk, graphite. Do you have one particular one that you prefer over the others, or do each have their own use and you just use them in different ways?
yeah, like since my work, when I said my work exploded, I think like I kind of went through another transformation like I did before the Miscreants of Tiny Town series, where I was like trying to start over from scratch and try to find out what my work looks like now and what am I doing. And so I kind of used those exploding figures as a way to experiment with, or yeah, kind of like start over with watercolor or start over with like markers. Yeah, so it'd be like I would start over. I'm going to start over from scratch and learn about watercolor again. And so then I spent like a couple of years like making these figures, but also like trying different paper out and researching, gum Arabic and the hot press and cold press and 300 pound and, like trying to find the right paper to use for the past couple of years and like use this new theme that I was working in as a way to experiment with the technique and how to present it too was another issue, like how I wanted my work to look in a gallery or out in public. And so I went through a whole phase of like, I really like using watercolor, but presenting it is bad because I hate putting it behind glass. I hate how that separates you from the work. So then I researched, mounting it on panels and then, how do you protect the work if it's on a panel? So then I found you can put wax on it. And so then that developed a whole thing. And then I thought, well, maybe I want something more permanent. So then I tried acrylic and then I found acrylic has a lot of limitations. And so then, I, had an idea of wanting it to be smoother looking or blended. And so then I tried oil for the first time since college, last year. And then just in trying oil, I blew my prices up just for the oil paintings. And then those started selling. It started selling to this other kind of tax bracket, I guess. But so like the oils I kind of save for certain international shows or things like that. So then I would try oil painting and getting really into the different brushes, the different paints, the different techniques and varnishes and all that goes into that. And then I thought, okay, well, I tried it. And now to take a break, I'm going to teach myself how to do graphite drawing again, just to simplify everything. So I develop a body of work of oils, and then now that's done. And now I bought a big antique kind of drafting table so I can teach myself graphite. And so that's it. Yeah. So now that's super minimal. And then I thought, well, I still like color. So now I'm going to use what I'm learning in graphite. And now I'm kind of teaching myself again, like digital painting. And now I'm kind of thinking that now that the digital painting thing, the prints are selling really well, I'm kind of thinking of different ways to present that as like a real artifact. So, or an artifact is like something that's tangible and real other than just sending out framed prints to shows. That's sort of what I'm struggling with right now. And so I'm looking at like modeling clay, and other 3D elements to try to make, frames, around the digital paintings. So I don't know. That's kind of like my next project, I think. Yeah. So I kind of go back and forth.
And I've read that you're constantly working. I mean, even on days off, you'll spend researching and studying different techniques. So obviously the act of creating just on its basic level excites you, but how do you keep from like getting burnt out just working so much?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe I am in just a perpetual state of burnout. I don't know. Like maybe the fact that I do so much research and looking and planning projects is a sign of burnout. Maybe it is. I don't know. Because it has become almost a habit. And I think now that I'm getting older, that idea of having a set schedule during the day and then being done and not thinking about it, that's becoming more and more appealing. And I think like maybe the reason that I'm trying all these different mediums and techniques is that I want to settle on something that I can develop, like a practice that I can develop over time and have like something consistent and steady. Because since everything has blown up, I'm searching for something that I can settle down with and do. But also, but yeah, I mean, it's comforting to, it's comforting to be in my own head, I guess, and to make plans for the future, if not in any kind of practical or like useful way, at least like artistically. It's, again, I think it goes back to having that world that you can control.
So what do you have upcoming? I mean, you have shows coming up that you're wanting to put work into, and what do you have in store for 2020?
Yeah, I think I've got a couple of solo shows coming up in New York and also locally. And I've got another group show I'll be in Australia. But I think I think now I think I'm going to keep pushing the digital work and the digital painting. I'm going to see where that goes and try to kind of buckle down and get that sort of steady rhythm that you were talking about, and sort of treat my work as like an office product. I'm going to try that this year and see how that goes. I think I might be making a collection of the pornography that I had made over the past year or two. I might be self-publishing some books. I don't know. I'm going to try I'm going to try the print thing for a while. That's been a really good experience. So I'm going to keep pushing that.
Have you explored, like, just done research on creating publications like books before? Is that something that you've been wanting to do?
Yeah, I had done kind of a little pamphlet. I had a show in Rome a few years ago where I made 5 paintings for like a show about Greek myths out there, and I thought that was like my first international show. I'm going to make a book about that, and so I just made like a small little pamphlet. But yeah, I think about, I think my work really lends to book illustration a lot. But that's something I've never pursued because my work has always been like a satire of illustration.
Yeah, but I think because it has that big narrative, though, like that, there seems to be a constant theme. So I think it would be well suited for publication. Yeah,
I think you're right. Yeah, so I'm gonna experiment with that this year. I'll see what happens.
Awesome. So where can people find you online?
Instagram.com, Alex Kuno, one word. That's pretty much my conduit. I have alexkunoartwork.com is my website, which I rarely update. And then I'm on Etsy, also Alex Kuno Artwork. First letters are capital.
Very cool. And last question, and this is something that I'm wanting to ask everybody. Who is one artist that you'd like to see me have on the show?
There are a lot. Since I'm on my recent graphite kick, I think Ozabu is really interesting. She's
amazing.
Yeah, right? Yeah, she is. I think what's his name? Show Chicken, also on Instagram. God, I could give you a list of 100. Pekka from Spain. I love her work. Peca. She does like kind of the spiritual, sexual side. Alison Summers is another one of my favorites. Lauren Marks' art. Sin Eater is really good.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thanks a ton for coming on the show, man. It's been a real treat having you on.
Oh, thanks a lot for having me. Good luck with the podcast. This is exciting.
So that's it for this episode of Art Affairs. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Alex. I really enjoyed talking with him. Like I said at the beginning of the interview, I'd never actually met him before this, so I was quite interested in some of the things I found out along the way. I found it especially fascinating how most of the art that he's created throughout his career, at least since he moved back to the Twin Cities and started, really solidifying his style, most or all of it has sort of been his way of processing the environment around him, and especially those events in his life that have been particularly hard to make sense of and wrap your head around. Everything from the difficult home life when he was growing up, to the post 9/11 climate in the US, to the changing political climate across the world today. All of those things are incredibly difficult to work through, and everyone has different ways of processing these sorts of things. And it seems that Alex processed them by creating, funneling that, somewhat uncomfortable energy into his work and as sort of a reaction to the shifting seas around him. So big thanks to Alex for joining me today, and thank you for checking out the show. I'm super grateful for your support. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any suggestions for the show, or if there's a guest you want me to try and have on. Also, if you have any questions you'd like me to ask future guests, send those over too. I'd love to hear any feedback you might have for me. You can contact me through my website at artafairspodcast.com, and like I said at the front of the show, you can go there to check out any previous episodes. You can also find the show on Instagram and Facebook at Art Affairs Podcast. And last but not least, if you're on Apple Podcasts, I'd really appreciate it if you took a moment to rate and review the show. I can't tell you how much that actually helps. So until next time, be good to yourself and be good to each other.